think it's a good idea to start off asking a series of questions. When it comes to source material, you might start off, for example, with who. Who exactly has written the piece that you're reading? What kind of qualifications do they have? Do they have a PhD? That doesn't, by the way, necessarily make them right, but it does lend a certain credibility or legitimacy, you might say, to what they're saying. Who's the publisher? What kinds of books does this publisher normally produce? What audience does the publisher have in mind? So that's the sort of who side. Then also in terms of what exactly information is being presented. Is it opinion? Is it fact? And that there's a bit of a grey zone there. Timeliness. When, if you're say, I get some of my students to write essays on the relevance of the Enlightenment nowadays. If you might find a journal article from 1972, it's perfectly fine. It talks about the Enlightenment. If you're doing an essay on the relevance of social media to protest movements, pretty much anything pre-late 1990s is irrelevant. So, there are various questions you need to ask, I think, when approaching source material. One of the things about communication studies, which is my area, it's so diverse and so broad. It encompasses lots of disciplines: psychology, media studies, cultural studies. So that makes it very, very difficult to sort of identify a gold standard, if you like. We have a lot of journalists in our programs, for example, and they tend to be very informed. They read a lot. They also tend to be very interested in new technology, social media, blogs. And while those sorts of things are very useful and online sources are really useful and important, I think that grey zone between fact and opinion is particularly pronounced in the case of blogs. So I think students need to be quite circumspect in terms of how they approach those sorts of sources. They're very useful. There's a lot of attention nowadays to things like citizen journalism as well. And the assumption there is that because people on the ground close to events as they're unfolding are taking footage on their phones or having conversations, that those sorts of sources are automatically more credible. I think there's a certain amount of truth in that kind of position, but I think at the same time students do need to stand back and again try to read around as much as they can. And of course that takes time. You can spot very quickly someone who has simply gone online and that's all they've used. And online sources are obviously really, really important. Nowadays it makes sense that students would use them, but say, for argument's sake, you might find a student who's using cites various books, but it's very obvious, even page numbers aren't included, that they haven't actually physically gone to the library and looked at this book and read it and taken time to maybe digest some of the arguments. It's basically cobbling together lecture notes and as many sources that they can get through a few Google searches, and that's pretty much it. So yes, I think in short, you can tell. For me, I think something that's important is, obviously we would ask that students would use academic source material as much as possible. At the same time, I teach a lot of cultural studies. Popular cultural sources, they're perfectly fine as well, as long as it's not too much. Again, it's something like if someone's writing on social media, I have absolutely no problem if someone brings in an article they read in a culture magazine or a U magazine or anything, as long as the whole essay isn't populated with sources of that kind, magazines, etc. But if there's a mix, I'm absolutely fine with it.